You are listening to Real Life and Other Fantasies, a podcast by engaging storytellers for engaged story listeners. Here's your host, author and journalist, Melvin E. Edwards.
Does the name Rick Hall ring any bells? Does this help?
Listen, all you wanna do is ride around Saturday.
What's the first thing you think of when you hear of Muscle Shoals, Alabama? Possibly this?
I was born and raised down in Alabama on a farm way back up in the woods. I was so ragged that folks used to call me Patches. Papa used to tease me about it, of course deep down inside he was hurt because he'd done all he could. My papa was a great old man.
Hello, fellow storytellers, and welcome to this edition of Real Life and Other Fantasies. Today, we're going to discuss the legacy of Rick Hall, the man whose musical ear and meticulous attention to detail put Muscle Shoals on the map. He produced songs like Mustang Sally by Wilson Pickett and Patches by Clarence Carter that you just heard, plus many, many more. Those songs are part of the American soundtrack, and his personal musical roots run along a parallel path. I'm also excited as we learn about Rick Hall, the man. That's why I'm pleased to welcome Rick Hall's son and my friend, Rick Hall Jr., to the show. Good morning, Rick.
Good morning, Melvin. It's great to be with you today.
So, Rick, I want to begin our conversation by talking a lot about Muscle Shoals and the way your dad established an infrastructure that obliterated racial barriers in segregated Alabama 60 years ago. Now, I just rewatched the Muscle Shoals documentary a couple days ago and was reminded of how close your dad's working and friendship relationships were with Wilson Pickett and Clarence Carter. So can you tell me a little bit about the dynamic and how he was able to build so much trust in the Black community in Alabama in the early 60s?
Yeah, I can try to. It's really it's hard to understand exactly how it evolved when you try to transport yourself back in time to how things were then. Is pretty freaking remarkable, isn't it? That you had, Black musicians and white musicians sitting on the couch together, cutting up, making music together, and it's pretty amazing. I mean, there's things about my dad's background, I think, that made him more empathetic, maybe more receptive to understanding how a Black man in the South might feel than your average person. Although his upbringing was in a very it's vestiges of slavery are still with us, right? The poor white population in Northwest Alabama lived in the hill country, where the rocky land, and that's what his dad had to work to try to make a living, and so he wasn't raised in an integrated environment, obviously, and I don't just mean in terms of schools, but the population around where he was raised was largely white. So it is interesting how he evolved and learned and became a guy that had that kind of trust. I mean, he had some tough things in his life early that I can tell you about that I think maybe made him more aware of other circumstances, if you will.
Absolutely. Actually, my next question was going to be about how his own life impacted the kind of man that he became and the relationships he carried throughout his life.
Yeah, he of course, there was a lot of grinding poverty. He was born in 1932, and his dad, had an elementary school education, so his dad was equipped for physical labor. Farming and logging basically is what he did. But a lot of people, were very poor back then. But some things happened early in his life that probably affected him. When he was an infant, he had an older brother fall into boiling water that his mother was boiling in the yard to wash clothes, and his brother died, and that was sort of the that kind of tragic death. You can imagine when you read today about stats of couples that lose a child, and you think back to that era. And I know my grandfather was a pretty hard man. My dad idolized him, but he was a very hard man, and so I think that was the beginning of the end for their marriage. I expect he blamed my grandmother. There's a joke even today among my family that, Halls, we have to blame somebody if something goes wrong. So it may be a genetic family problem, but their marriage deteriorated, and very unusually back then, they got divorced. And my grandfather kept my dad and his younger sister and had custody. I don't know if he had legal custody of them or just by force of arms, because my dad tells a story about my grandmother sending men to come get him, where my dad's grandmother, my great-grandmother, her paternal grandmother, basically with a shotgun sent the men away and said, "No, you're not taking the boys. Tell Dolly they're going to stay with Herman." Dolly was my grandmother. So, it was a rough and tumble kind of existence. But so he comes from divorce, and then, I wouldn't normally tell this, but my dad told this when he was a child, and I'm not sure the age. His dad told him that his mother was working as a prostitute. And so you can imagine the kind of trauma that would have on a young person. I feel like my dad, whether it was true or not, always felt like others were looking down on him. He felt like others didn't give him the respect. He felt like he was, treated as a second-class citizen. And I think some of that was more in his mind. I hope it was, but it's definitely the way he felt. But, having those feelings maybe made him more empathetic with someone else that society wasn't according, the proper respect to. I mean, I never heard my dad put down a poor person in my whole life, but man, he could read the riot act to the silk stocking crowd, as he called them. He did not value people who had an easy life, who inherited money, who didn't work hard. He just didn't value those people, and he would run them down, and he would build up the man who was digging a ditch, and that's just the way he always was. So maybe some of those experiences in his life made him more receptive to working with black artists and black musicians. But I know I can tell you a story of something that happened, but I know he didn't start out, this enlightened guy in 1961. That's not the way it happened. I think he evolved and learned.
Sure, I'd love to hear about it.
Well, we got to put ourselves back in time, because I don't want to make my dad look bad. But so after he died, my first cousin found some letters that had been written between my dad and his mother. And he later in life, I knew my grandmother, and he had a relationship with her, but found some letters that he had written to his mother and also to his dad. And so one of the letters that he wrote to his mother was in 1961, and he was telling her about his new baby boy, who you're talking to right now. I was just a few months old. But he also was telling her that he had recorded an album on this guy named Arthur Alexander, and he thought it was going to be a big hit. And he referred to Arthur Alexander as a colored boy, which I'm sure was pretty common vernacular back at that time. But when I read that letter in 2018 or 19 after my dad died, I was like shocked. And the reason I was shocked was because I can remember as an 8 or 9 year old in the late 60s, and I know I was that age because I remember where we were. I remember the house we lived in. I can remember my dad teaching me to never refer to a black man as a boy, that it was very demeaning and it was very hurtful, and I should never do that. So, something happened between 1961 and 1969, as an estimate, that caused my dad to learn and be aware. And so, what I think happened is he went into the studio with black artists because he wanted to have a hit record. But as part of that working together, he saw the commonality that we all have, and the similarities, and developed friendships, and listened and learned about what was hurtful to them, and what would affect them adversely. So I think he evolved. I think he learned it, and it's a good testament to what goes on today. I mean, I know you and I share similar views about this. It's just us versus them, and we don't associate with people that have differences, and it's a good example of learning from others that you deal with who are different from you, and you find out you're a lot more similar than you thought.
Absolutely. There's no question about that. So you mentioned Arthur Alexander. So my next question leads me into that. So after your dad enjoys some worldwide success with Arthur Alexander and Percy Sledge, the word about him started to get around and eventually reached, about him and his talented rhythm section called the Swampers. That word eventually reached Atlantic Records executive Jerry Wexler in New York City. And then Jerry brought in a young singer named Aretha something or other. You probably have heard of her. Brought her down to Fame Records to record. So can you tell me about his relationship with Jerry Wexler and Aretha Franklin?
Yeah. So, Dad had a hit record with Arthur Alexander, and that sort of put him on the radar screen for Jerry Wexler. With the money from Arthur Alexander's success, he built a studio. So then he had the Tams come in and do What Kind of Fool Do You Think I Am? He did some work with Jimmy Hughes, had a big record called Still Away, had a number of R&B artists come in and play with his then rhythm section, which was pre-Swampers. From 1961 to 64, he had a rhythm section made up of Norbert Putnam, David Briggs, and Jerry Kerrigan, who went on to Nashville and became really successful session players there, and producers in their own right. But he had that history going, and so at some point he was introduced to Wexler, talked to Wexler, and Wexler said, "Rick, if you hear something that's a hit record, call me." So my dad heard Percy Sledge, When a Man Loves a Woman, which my dad did not produce. A local man named Quinn Ivey produced that, who was a friend of my dad. And Dad called Jerry Wexler and said, "I think I've got a hit." And it turned out to be, at that time, the biggest record I think Atlantic Records had ever had. So that really cemented his relationship with Jerry Wexler, who was a man that my dad greatly admired, learned a tremendous amount from, learned about how to do the music business, if you will. And so first, Jerry Wexler sent down Wilson Pickett. And then a few months later, I think, the session occurred with Aretha Franklin. And, the Aretha Franklin at that time was within the music business, was thought of as a huge talent, but she had never had a hit record. And so from that first session, she had her first hit records, "I Never Loved a Man the Way I Loved You" and "Do Right Woman, Do Right Man." And so I can tell you the story about what happened during that session that nearly ruined my dad's career.
Well, before you go there, I want to tell a little bit more background, and then we'll get up to that story if you don't mind. So,
sure.
Doing my research here, I think it's probably fair to say that not only did your dad put Muscle Shoals, Alabama on the map, but he probably also put Aretha Franklin on the map. You mentioned her first hit was "I Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You," was recorded at Fame recording studios in Muscle Shoals, and her Hall of Fame Rock and Roll Hall of Fame bio goes on to say, quote, "The legendary one-day session marked not only the emergence of a prodigious talent, but the start of a new era of fresh, forthright soul music." And your dad was mostly responsible for that, yet somehow his name seems to be fading from history. And people remember what he did, but not really who he was. So a lot of what I hope to do during this episode is to bridge the gap, to introduce, if you will, a new generation of people to your dad, his legacy in Muscle Shoals, and some of the history, good or bad, whatever it takes to create the full picture of who he was. But just a little bit more background. So by the time Jerry Wexler signed Aretha, she had just been dropped by Capitol Records. And as you said, she had had no real success up until that point. And she was known as for doing sort of jazz standards. And then her first recording at Fame led to a million-selling double-sided smash. And that album won her a Grammy Award in 1967. And that's pretty significant because in 1967, the musical competition was some acts that most people probably heard of, like the Beatles, Bob Dylan, Frank Sinatra, Rolling Stones. So it was a pretty big deal for Aretha, who had her highest charting album up until that point on the Billboard Top 200 had only reached number 69. And then to come out with something like this, which was a worldwide smash, was, I'm sure, helped your dad's reputation. And even though what happened during the recording during that one-day session that you'll lead us into next took a negative toll, it still got him started. He may have had to restart after that, but it gave him a pretty good foothold. So now if you could lead into what happened during that session and right after between your dad and Aretha's entourage and Jerry Wexler, I'd appreciate it.
And you're right. My dad was, I think, instrumental to that, and he put together the musicians, and he was critical of that. There were a lot, My dad, you're right, probably doesn't get enough credit there, but there are musicians that get even less. So I want to always remember those guys. And you probably saw in the documentary a guy named Spooner Oldham, who's a keyboard player that worked with my dad forever and many others. He sort of made that session by finding the right groove initially. And so the session was after Spooner found the lick that was gonna make the song work. The session was a huge success. And as Jerry Wexler, I think, said, that my dad and all the others were drinking from the same bottle, including Aretha's husband at that time. And if you saw the recent movie about Aretha, you saw that he was a pretty emotionally and even physically abusive man, but he was a very domineering man. Even then, he was very domineering, and in the session, I mean. And so at some point, somebody flirted with Aretha. One of the horn players flirted with Aretha, and I think his name was Ted. I blanked on his name, but anyway, her husband demanded the guy be fired, and Dad says to Jerry, "What should I do?" And Jerry said, "Fire him." So they fired the horn player that had flirted with Aretha, but that sort of changed the entire vibe. So later that evening, my dad, after a few more drinks, and alcohol never served my dad well, I can say, a lot of us, but certainly didn't serve my dad well. After a few more drinks, he told Jerry Wexler he was going to go see Ted at the hotel, and they were going to work it out and get things back on a smooth course. And of course, Wexler, knowing that by that time Ted was probably drunk, and knowing my dad had too much to drink, begged him not to go. And my dad went anyway. Well, long story short, my dad and Ted end up in a fist fight on the balcony of the hotel, as my dad said, both trying to throw each other over the balcony. So it turns into a drunken brawl. And my dad was a tall man, but he was very skinny. I'm glad he survived. Is all I can say. But it was a fist fight, and essentially at the end of that, of course, Jerry Wexler was totally, understandably, very angry with my dad because he told him not to do it. Right? He was an older man and wiser, and Dad was probably 33, 34 at the time, and thought he knew better. So anyway, and so Wexler basically said, "Well, we're leaving. I'll never bring anybody back. Your history." And it was, and my dad said words back to him. So it was a bad deal because, Atlantic Records and Jerry Wexler, if he'd kept that relationship, he had a great career after that. But if he'd kept it, it would have been even better. And he still did keep some Atlantic acts. We can talk about Wilson Pickett and Clarence Carter that he kept even after that blow up. But he didn't get any other Atlantic acts coming his way. So it was a big, as my dad said, a big screw up.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we need to take a break for a message from our sponsor. When we return, we're going to talk about how the second branch of your dad's legacy involved losing his rhythm section to the same Jerry Wexler who had brought Aretha to him. So we'll be right back.
Make 1908 House of Wine and Ale your new favorite destination between San Antonio and New Braunfels. With 15 ales on tap, more than 30 craft beers in cans and bottles, and over 70 wines, we have a selection that's perfect for both relaxing with a glass or gathering with your friends. We even have wine on tap.
That's right, we have wine on tap.
www.1908houseofwine.com.
Family and animal friendly.
The Wimberley Story Fest will be held from October 12th through the 14th in the picturesque Texas Hill country town of Wimberley. The 2023 Story Fest will celebrate story in all its forms. This year's 3-day festival in Pioneer Town highlights storytellers, singer-songwriters, filmmakers, and visual artists. You can also join us on Friday and Saturday evenings around the campfire for songs and stories. It will be a big weekend for stories, and there will also be interesting activities associated with the annular eclipse on Saturday. October 12th to the 14th is the weekend. Wimberley, Texas is the place. We are proud that the Real Life and Other Fantasies podcast is a sponsor of the Wimberley Story Fest. Go to their website for tickets and more information at www.wimberleystoryfest.org. That's www.wimberleystoryfest.org. See you there.
We're back with Rick Hall Jr. to talk about his dad's legacy with Fame Recording Studios in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. So his house band was eventually unofficially called the Swampers, and they were immortalized in the Southern rock anthem Sweet Home Alabama by Leonard Skinner. Your dad had assembled this band and was on a roll musically. And then Jerry Wexler came down and made them an offer, from what I understand, from the documentary, that was just too good for them to refuse. And they left and formed their own record company on the other side of town in the little town of Muscle Shoals. But when that happened, your dad eventually picked himself back up, formed a brand new band, and then resumed making hits. And in 1971, he was named the Billboard magazine's Executive of the Year, and this was after the Swampers had left. Do you think that was one of his proudest achievements?
Yeah, I think my dad, one of my favorite football coaches says, was very resilient. That's a Nick Saban word. My dad was very resilient, and he lost the rhythm section in 1964, and he put the Swampers together. And they were, fabulous, and had cut a lot of hit records with them, and then they went on to cut a lot more hit records. But in I think it was 1969 or 1970, they left, and Jerry Wexler funded them to build their own recording studio. And so Dad was, I remember this is sort of the first thing I remember as a child. I mean, my parents were devastated. Mm-hmm. And it was a big deal because he had already blown the Wexler relationship, and now that was coming back to bite him more because Wexler was sort of taking the house band and setting them up, doing their own thing. And so it was like, is my career over? And my dad was the most driven, the most hardworking man I've ever known. And so he assembled a new rhythm section. He produced, on the heels of that, Patches. He produced Fancy on Bobby Gentry, which was a big hit. Little Richard came to the studio and cut an album. Then he did work with the Osmonds, which sold a gazillion records, and he was still working with Wilson Pickett. And then following up on that, Mac Davis in 1971, 1972. So in that time frame, he had the kick in the gut. He lost this great rhythm section. He started over with new people, and you're not getting experienced, session players to come to Muscle Shoals, Alabama. These are kids, right? His first rhythm section, they were all teenagers when he started in 1961. And then the Swampers were maybe not teenagers, but they were early 20s at best. So he was dealing with new, inexperienced musicians. And as you said, he was Billboard Magazine's #1 record producer of the year in 71, and he was in the top 10 69, 70, 71, 72. He was one of the top record producers in the country. So he overcame that obstacle big time.
That's extremely impressive. That's a pretty big deal. And so after some members of the Swampers left to form their own record company, Muscle Shoals Sound, your dad slowly drifted away from soul and R&B to record mostly country music. So my question is, did the Osmonds end up in Muscle Shoals because they were a little bit country and a little bit rock and roll?
Here's the sad truth. I think they ended up in Muscle Shoals because their record company wanted a white act that would sound like the Jackson 5. Because the first record, my dad, big record he cut was One Bad Apple, written by George Jackson, a black songwriter that worked with Dad, who had written a lot of R&B hits. So they were trying to have sort of an R&B sound with the Osmond brothers. Now you're referring to Donny and Marie later, and that was the little bit country, a little bit rock and roll. But they were trying to have a an R&B feel with the Osmonds, who were great. Just as an aside, absolutely fabulous human beings, just super classy family, top to bottom. And they came back over the years as I was older, on into even college. They came back and recorded some. They're just super people. I can tell you about what happened as he went into the country arena a little bit. And it really wasn't so much that he just said, okay, I'm going to do country. So in 71, he recorded a new act, Mac Davis, who was a fabulous songwriter, but it was not an artist, had not had a hit record as an artist. Had a big record with him. He had a couple of other big records with other artists after that. Paul Anka, still doing Wilson Pickett, but the biggest hits with Wilson came early. Mustang Sally, Land of a Thousand Dances, Funky Broadway. Those all were one session. If you listen to those songs now, they're classics. They're all one session. But so in 1972, I was 11 years old, and my dad had bought a farm. And in 74, he and Mother decided to build a house on the farm. And when I was 12 was the first year my dad coached me in Little League Baseball. And so what I'm telling you is what really happened was he stepped back from the business and became a dad. and got into the farm, and he wasn't grinding away as hard in the studio. You know, he was recording Paul Anka, and famously nearly got fired because he would knock off at 3:30 to go coach baseball. And so he he stepped back from the music business while they were building the house, and it was, overdone. And Dad was hands on. I mean, he was there with the carpenters every day, and physically working with them. He just enjoyed doing that. And he lost his mojo, right? He lost his momentum. And suddenly he looked up and started wanting to step back into the business and do a lot more productions in, 76, 77, 78, and nobody wanted to use him, or at least major artists didn't want to use him. And so that led him to country, and really that came through Mac Davis, which is another story. But that came from his producing Mac Davis, who had himself sort of evolved more to the country genre.
So fame has welcomed over the years a literal who's who of music royalty, from Etta James to Wilson Pickett to Aretha Franklin, recently to Alicia Keys, Demi Lovato, and Jason Isbell. So you mentioned Mac Davis sort of getting that second train rolling. Can you tell me some of your favorite stories around the artists that he worked with, or some of the ones that you may have interacted with while they were there in Muscle Shoals?
Yeah. And, Dobie Gray, who was an artist. Most of the ones I had interaction with were in the 70s, because I was, old enough. But when we were little kids, we weren't around. But Mac Davis and Dobie Gray were two artists I was around a lot. Mac more than Dobie, just because he worked with Dad more. Dobie was very. I was a bookworm at the time. I loved to read, and so he would give me books. History books to read and trivia history books to read. And Mac was just, Mac would stay at our house. One of the reasons my dad built a big house on the farm was that there really weren't any good hotels for people to stay in. And so a lot of times the artists would stay with us. Dobie stayed with us. Mac stayed with us. And and Mac came a bunch, so he stayed with us a lot. And, we're teenagers. Well, Mac, in a lot of ways, was a big teenager. He was a huge cut up. They would record during the day. Mother would cook a big dinner at night, and then we'd sit up and play pool and listen to Dad and Mac tell jokes till bedtime. So Mac was just a really, really good guy. As I say, a lot of fun, and a big cut up for three teenage boys. I had two younger brothers, and so he was just he was like one of us, and we were pulling pranks on my dad, and my dad would pull pranks on Mac, and they're just picking at each other all the time. So it was a big time when he came. The three boys were like hog heaven. Mac's coming, so it's going to be a big time.
So I'm sure that was you just look forward to that probably for weeks.
Yeah, and most of the other artists, I really in the 60s, I was a child, and so I really was not around that much, really at all. I've gotten to know a lot of the musicians that worked with him back then as I've gotten older.
So do you have any other favorite artists who worked there at Fame Recording Studios more recently?
Well, I love Jason Isbell, by the way. I mean, Jason started as a songwriter with us, and his success as an artist is in part because he's a fabulous songwriter, but his success as an artist has been separate from the studio. But I love his music. My favorite music that my dad made was probably Wilson Pickett stuff. I didn't know Wilson Pickett in any material way, but that's the music that I like the best is the R&B stuff and Wilson Pickett stuff particularly. I got in trouble when I was 10 or 11 because Donny Osmond came to the house. He was a couple of years older, and I guess the older the older kids in the Osmond brothers were recording, and they had a break. So Donny came to the house to play, and I convinced him to climb over our wooden fence in the backyard and sneak out and roam through the neighborhood, which he was horrified to do because he was afraid he'd be recognized. And as he climbed over the fence, he hung his wrist on a rusty nail.
Oh no!
And hurt himself. So I got in a bit of trouble. We got caught because of the wound, but he's probably the only artist that when I was a kid I had any interaction with to amount to anything, and I guess that's because he was a kid too.
So you made it your point of trying to corrupt Donny Osmond.
Yeah, and So the next week I go to school and all the girls are mad at me because I didn't tell them he was there. Of course, he was horrified of girls finding out he was there because by that time he was a big star, and it was not they're great resilient people, but I wouldn't want to be a child star. I mean, just seeing how he was just worried about any idea of being recognized and being mobbed, and you wouldn't wish that on anybody.
Wow. So your dad fortunately passed away in 2018. And there was a great article written about him in Rolling Stone magazine. And within that story, it said that to date, the studio and his publishing company has been responsible for an estimated 350 million record sales, with songs from everyone from the Beatles to George Strait. And that's a pretty endearing and enduring legacy.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing, isn't it? In a little cotton town of Muscle Shoals that they were able to pull that off. And still, major hits, songwriting perspective, particularly in the 80s and the 90s and in the 2000s, there have been a lot of major hits come out of Muscle Shoals from songwriters, and recording has actually picked back up too. The recording studio business model with technology sort of changed, and it was harder to make a go of it. But now people are sort of coming back to the studio. The documentary about Muscle Shoals has caused people to pay attention to that, and they want to come and record in a historical studio. So that part of the business has picked back up a lot in the recent years.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible. And I don't know where you would personally rank Fame recording studios, but for me, as a music fan, I would put it in the same league as Abbey Road and Motown. Where would you? How would you, in your humble way, rank it?
Well, it obviously probably would not rank above those two, and I think for 60 years across a lot of genres of music, it's been churning out hits and been a home base for super talented artists and musicians and songwriters. So I think I'm glad you would rank it that high, and I wouldn't. That'd be sort of silly to disagree with you. Maybe I'm just going to join into that view. But it's a pretty incredible place. I mean, to think that my dad, I never thought about my dad in this way, but Norbert Putnam, who was in the first rhythm section, later went on to be a great record producer. He and I have become friends since he moved back to Florence a few years ago. And he said, your dad was the only one of us that was an entrepreneur. And I'd never thought about my dad in that way, but Dad wanted to build a studio. He wanted to build a publishing company. He wanted to be a record producer. He wanted to have hit records, but he wanted to build a business that worked in the music field. So, here's a guy who gets some money with Arthur Alexander. I mean, my parents are living in a rented apartment at the time, and instead of getting him a nice car and getting a place to live, he puts it into a recording studio and borrows some money to go with it. And then the next thing you know, you look at the chronology in the early 60s, they're blowing and going. And cutting major hits on great R&B artists. So he had a vision there that I until I got older, I didn't give him credit for. It's like, oh, it's just my dad. I never thought about my dad as being anything special musically. But as I've gotten older, obviously that changed.
Yeah, that legacy is absolutely amazing. And in preparing for this episode, I've done a lot of research, and the more I find out about him, the more I want to find out about him. It's an absolutely incredible legacy. So I want to open it up a little bit more and give you time to just share whatever you want us to share. But within that, I'd like for you to spend a little bit of time talking about the upcoming golf tournament and the charity that you support.
Yeah. So one thing that about my dad, he was Jekyll and Hyde in some ways, but he made everybody that worked with him better at what they did. And I've joked that my dad had all these platitudes, but he's the guy that I know that most lived up to the platitudes. I mean, do everything as well as you can do it. I mean, here and we're going to visit here in Muscle Shoals soon, but I'll show you some things he made. If he's making his daughters a go-kart, it's going to be a well-designed, brilliant, immaculate go-kart. What if he's making a piece of furniture? Whatever he did, if he's working on his tractor, whatever he did as best as he could do, and he communicated that to others. And so I think if you talk to the musicians that worked under him, they became better. And then when you look at some of the musicians, then those people spread out and had this tremendous influence. So his influence from the people that worked directly with him then goes down to people that worked under those folks. If anybody asked about my dad, he may have been a musical genius. I'm not musically talented, but I know what hard work is, and I know what doing your best is, and that's what I say was exceptional about my dad. He absolutely did his best. Now, the charity you mentioned is a home for abused, neglected, and abandoned girls that is actually, I told you in the early 70s, mid 70s, my dad built a home on the farm. It's actually in our family home, which is too big for people to live in. So we now have a lot of young ladies that live in it. And, the family generally has supported the charity. It's part of the Alabama Sheriff's Youth Ranches, which has several homes throughout the state. And my wife was the director of the organization locally of the ranch locally, and now she's stepped down and just helps with fundraising. But we are sending kids to college. We're teaching kids to drive. We're teaching them job skills. We're helping them excel in school. We're taking kids to the beach who've never seen the beach. I mean, and so this is a great organization, and it was part of my parents' passion because of some of the obstacles my dad had, but it was also my wife's passion. This was a vision that Cindy had when we were dating. She first mentioned this to me. We were engaged, but she first mentioned that maybe one day we could do something like this. And so it's a great organization, and we've got a charity event that's upcoming in September 21st. It's a golf tournament, but also a music event. And the music event, the people playing at it are called the Muscle Shoals All-Stars. And it's going to be David Hood will play some, who's who's the only surviving swamper. Many of the session musicians that in 1970 my dad put together after the Swampers started their own studio, they'll be playing. So it's a band of legends, if you will. Spooner Oldham will play, who's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a musician, who I mentioned earlier really made the Aretha session kick off. And so it's a fun music event. The community really supports it, and it's a really great thing that we're very proud of.
Well, I'm definitely looking forward to to learning more about it and being there in Muscle Shoals. I can't even tell you how excited I am. Well, I can tell you, but it wouldn't really fully express how excited I am about getting to be there on the grounds and see some of the photos and hear more of the stories and just experience and just take in the atmosphere there in Muscle Shoals, Alabama.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that too, Melvin. I've probably done a poor job of describing. It's hard to put it in words, and you're right. If you can be there and look at the pictures, and you've probably seen some video clips too. Which, oddly enough, the reason my dad has those video clips is he got into coaching his boys in ball, and he would film us playing ball. So he would take those same 8mm camera to the recording studio and record some of the sessions. So it's really amazing to see those guys back in that era doing what they did.
Well, I'm glad they were able to get everything on record and keep it living on in perpetuity. Those you mentioned, Wilson Pickett. Those records will be listened to forever. Yeah,
I think they will. I mean, it's classic stuff, and a lot of the stuff is, but. Obviously, Aretha's stuff will be listened to forever. And the Swampers continued to play on all her stuff, by the way. I mean, even though my dad sort of messed his situation up, the Muscle Shoals guys continued to play on her sessions and, for many, many albums. So all of her success, all of her major success is rooted in Muscle Shoals talent, if you will.
And speaking of Muscle Shoals talent, let's enjoy a bit of that Muscle Shoals talent one more time as I take us to the conclusion of today's show. And once again, I would like to thank Rick Hall Jr. for joining us here today to talk about his dad and the legacy that he built in Muscle Shoals, Alabama. And that's it for another edition of Real Life and Other Fantasies. As we take one more listen to Wilson Pickett on the way out, I'd like to remind you to join us again next time for another fascinating mental road trip. Until then, don't forget to shine some light wherever you go.
All you wanna do is ride around Saturday. All you wanna do is ride around Saturday.
That was another edition of Real Life and Other Fantasies with your host, Melvin E. Edwards. Join us again next time for more stories about more things than you can imagine. Some of those true stories may even be about real life. See you next time.
I hope you're enjoying this episode of Real Life and Other Fantasies. To hear the latest stories by the most interesting storytellers, subscribe to this podcast. New episodes are released every Tuesday at 5 a.m. Central Time. That way, you can listen on your way to work or while you enjoy your second cup of coffee and decide if you really need that job. Also, please don't forget to rate each episode. That's Real Life and Other Fantasies on Spotify, Apple, Google, Amazon, iHeart, and Odyssey podcast platforms.